Hi Year 4, we're ready to read chapter 3 of Street Child. And this chapter is called Rosie and Judd. Mrs. Jarvis used up a lot of her remaining strength that morning. She led the children away from the slums where they had lived for the past year and down street after street until they came to a much quieter part of town, where the houses were big and stately. She leaned against some railings to rest. Emily sat down next to her, anxious for her mother. "Now you've got to be good," Mrs. Jarvis said to them. "I'm going to take you to the house where I used to work, only you must be good, promise me now." "Ah, of course we'll be good," Emily said. Mrs. Jarvis nodded. "Yes, you're always good," she said. "That's one thing I did right anyway." In the window behind them, a finch sang in a cage. It only had room to hop from the floor of its cage to a little perch, and down again. Hop, 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 up and down. "Listen to that bird," said Jim. "They only sing when they're on their own," Emily told him. "He's singing for a friend." "Poor little thing," said Lizzie, "trapped in a cage." "We better go on," their mother said. "I'm going to take you to see the only friend I've got in the world. Rosie, she's called. You've heard me talk about Rosie at the big house." The children nodded. It was a long time since their mother had worked in his lordship's kitchen, but she still had stories to tell them about it. "And if Rosie can't help us," she sighed, "nobody can." Emily helped her up again, and they moved slowly on, pausing as the carriages swept past them. When they reached the big house at last, Mrs. Jarvis was exhausted and sat down on the steps to rest again. The children gazed up at the tall building. "Is this where we're going to live?" asked Lizzie. "It's too grand for us, Lizzie," said Emily. Even though she was only 10, she knew that families like theirs didn't end up in houses like these. Jim's eyes were fixed on something he could see on the top steps just by the front door. It was an iron boot scraper, and it was in the shape of a dog's head. The huge snapping mouth of the dog was wide open, so people could scrape the mud off their boots in its teeth. "I'd never put my foot in there," he said. "Not even with Lizzie's boots on, I wouldn't. It'd come snarling down on me and bite my toes right off." When their mother was rested, she picked up her bundle again and led the children down some steps to the basement of the house. She sank against the door, all strength gone. "Be good," she murmured to them. She lifted the knocker. They heard rapid footsteps coming. Mrs. Jarvis quickly bent down and kissed both the girls on the tops of their heads. "God bless you both," she said. Emily looked up at her, suddenly afraid. She was about to ask her mother what was happening when the door was opened by a large, flowery woman in a white pinafore. She had the sleeves of her dress rolled up, so her arms bulged out of them. Her hands and wrists were covered in dough, and as she flung up her arms in greeting, Jim could see that her elbows were red and powdery. "Annie Jarvis," the woman gasped. "I never thought to see you again." She hugged her, covering her with bits of dough. "You ain't come looking for work, have you, after all this time? Judd's going spare, she is, looking for a new cook. She's got me at it, and my dough's like a boulder. You could build cathedrals out of it, and they wouldn't ever fall down. She'll soon put me back on serving upstairs." While she was talking, she hauled Mrs. Jarvis and the children into the kitchen and set stools for them round the stove, balancing herself on a high chair and scooping up more flour. She pushed aside the big mixing bowl and sat with her elbows on the table, beaming across at them. And then her smile changed. She reached over to Mrs. Jarvis and put her hand on her forehead. "Hot." Her voice was soft with concern. "You're so hot, Annie, and white as snow." She looked at the children and at the bundles of clothes and belongings that they were still clutching. "You've been turned out, haven't you?" Mrs. Jarvis nodded. "You got anywhere?" "No." "And you're not fit for work, you know that. There's no work left in you, Annie Jarvis." A bell jangled over the door, and Rosie jumped up and ran to the stove. "Lord, that's for the coffees, and I ain't done 'em. Anyone comes down, you duck under the table, quick mind," she said to the children. The bell rang again. All right," she shouted. "His lordship can wait 5 minutes, can't he, while I talk to my friend here?" She glanced at Mrs. Jarvis again, her face puckered in frowns. "My sister as good as. No, he can't wait. His lordship waits for nothing."